in the wall, led a line down to the basement, and they listened in while he and his mistress did their thing. And this guy was a mafia boss, and he was trying to kill Mickey Cohen for years, and he killed, a lot of bodies were falling in that era. Never could get him for murder. You know what they got him for? Lewd conduct, based on the bug in his headboard. I mean, that was typical of you got what victories you could. And I will give you one more story, Michael. One of my main cops, frustrated in their inability to get Mickey Cohen, convinced one of Mickey's guards at his home to quit and to suggest to Mickey that he hire someone else in his place, a guy who had great credentials, who had been a munitions expert in the war. And this other fellow happened to be Sergeant Jack O'Mara's paid informant. That's how O'Mara got a guard inside Mickey's home. Literally, Mickey was one of Mickey's security guards in this well-protected home with searchlights and a fortified window with a little porthole in it. And so one day, the cop gets the guard to convince Mickey that his guns could use a cleaning and test firing. The guard takes all of Mickey's guns out of the home, brings them to the police firing range, takes off the butt plates, etches his initials under the butt plates, puts the butt plates back on, gives them to Mickey's guard, who brings them back to Mickey. Mickey says, "Oh, thank you very much for doing this," and, he has the guns back. Well, they've now planted a trap for Mickey Cohen. If his guns ever show up in a murder, they'll know they're his. Of course, they're not registered to him, no surprise. And the trap was set, and it took 10 years. 10 years for those guns to show up in a murder, but they did, and it was at the murder of Jack the Enforcer Whalen, who was this other one-man Irish gang. So that's some of the stuff they did.
Were these rough tactics effective?
In a way, on the surface, if you looked at getting convictions, they finally did get a conviction in a gang murder. Whether it was the right guy or not, you have to read the material to see whether that's the case. But finally, the first time in the 20th century, they did. But what happened in the courts was trivial to what happened outside the courts. And the most significant thing was that L.A. never developed a mafia like there was back east. In fact, it later was derided as a Mickey Mouse mafia. And the case could be made that these guys were partially responsible for that. I mean, they sort of convinced the mob that L.A. was not a very hospitable place. So I think in the end, they had that satisfaction.
The Gangster Squad's image had a little help from the media in Hollywood back then, I guess.
Well, I will tell you. I mean, again, there's what the public sees, the civilians. And of course our society is the same way today. You're given a certain picture by any institution. We're all like this, by the way, and it's not just police departments, it's not just politicians, it's not just those of us in the media. I mean, in some ways we present the public image, and then there's what goes on behind the scenes. There were two things that really changed the image of the LAPD in the 1950s. I mean, it had been a horribly corrupt department, and it really did gain the reputation as the most professional in the country. Two things changed it. Number one was this Chief Parker, who had been in charge of the detention facilities for the Germans at Normandy in the war, and he was a lawyer, and he was into internal affairs. He was a tough guy, and he really imposed a new military discipline on the LAPD. They looked good. They started they were trained. They were educated. That was one thing that helped promote the image of the LAPD, and rightfully so. The second thing was Dragnet. First it was a radio show and then a great TV show, and it was started by this guy, Jack Webb, who was a young actor-producer, and it was about two very by-the-book kind of yes-ma'am cops. The famous line was "just the facts, ma'am." And Jack Webb, who played Sergeant Friday, and his partner, would go through the cases. Well, the LAPD, seeing that this burnished their image, always provided Jack Webb with their files. And in fact, the one time he made a movie based on Dragnet in 1954 was actually based on a case handled by the Gangster Squad, then was being called Intelligence, in which he, one of the main characters was the head of it, Captain Hamilton, Chief Parker, and they were huge hero characters. Well, meanwhile, here's the realpolitik. Here's how the world works. Jack Webb was married to one of the great, sexy singers of the day, this woman, Julie London, and very few people today would remember her, but if you're old enough, you remember her, and I invite people to Google her, because she was, really the item. She was absolutely sexy and slinky and sultry and the whole deal. Well, they were married, and then they went the way of Hollywood and were getting a divorce. So here's how the world works. He calls up the chief of police. His show Dragnet is, doing wonders for the LAPD. Says, I'm going through this hairy divorce, and can you guys give me a little help? To wit, can you send over one of the bugmen? And I tell the story. One of the bugmen recalls being sent over, and Webb had his own private eye and wanted help to bug his wife, who he was going through this very costly divorce with. And that's sort of what happened. I mean, he did them a favor, and they did him a favor. So there's the realpolitik of the world. And, Jack Webb, to the end of his days, was still creating great pictures of the LAPD. Later on, he produced, the Adam, what was the name of that TV show, that also, presented cops as these really kind of square, by-the-book guys. And in reality, they were somewhat square. They believed the world was black and white, but they were not quite as pure as the TV image would suggest.
What ultimately became of the men of the gangster squad?
Well, civilians, what I call them, who hear what these guys did, took hoodlums up into the hills, and I always say, what do you think these guys did when they retired? First of all, let me say, none of them retired with glory, in a way. You do the dirty job. This is the same in the military, in any kind of institution like this. You really give them the dirty job. In the end, they don't make you heroes. Some of the bosses get credit for this, but the ones who are insulated from the dirty work that you do in these jobs, and almost all felt they weren't appreciated. They slunk out of the LAPD when they could retire. One of my main cops was sent to the jail for his final years. Jail duty, et cetera, et cetera. So all the guys kind of retired somewhat bitter about their police careers, and I will ask what I call civilians, well, what do you think they did in their lives? And most of them say, well, maybe they could have been security guards or something like that. I can't tell you how wrong they were. The most roguish of my cops, the one who went furthest over the line and sort of developed an alliance with this mobster called the Enforcer, he became a multimillionaire businessman. He helped contractors put in garage doors, security systems, everything under the sun, developed shopping centers, had residential properties. He became a multimillionaire with a house on the beach, sat in his backyard, and he kind of joked in his later days that his police pension paid his liquor bill. And he'd sit back there with his buddies and watch the shapely young beach girls go by. That was one of them. A couple of others became fabulously rich, also were very clever. One of the bugmen, the one who did a favor for Jack Webb, guess what he did? Went to law school, became a lawyer, then became a judge. Got training at Oxford, tried murder cases. The bugman became one of the most distinguished judges in L.A. Finally, the guy who took the hoodlums up in the hills, he became head of racetrack security for the two big racetracks in L.A. County. And that was kind of interesting, but he also had a daughter who was particularly bright, and the daughter of the cop who took hoodlums up in the hills got a Ph.D. in business affairs and real estate from Harvard and taught at Harvard. So, it was, these guys really were the best and the brightest. As I said, they had been through the war, they'd been through the Depression. In another era, I'm not sure what they would have done in younger life, but police work in that era was well paid, it was secure, and it attracted these very brave and brilliant guys. So afterwards, I say that's really justice. While they had those careers, Mickey Cohen died a cripple in his early 60s with an estate of $3,000. So really, Mickey died a kind of languishing death, and the cops really distinguished themselves. So they showed what they were made of.
Paul Lieberman, thanks for being on the Savage Nation. Fascinating series.
Michael, thank you very much for listening to all my blather. Check out our Gangster Squad stories on